Everyone, my name is Will Wright. I work for the Los Angeles chapter of the American Institute of Architects, and it is a delight to introduce Rick Corsini, AIA, who is helping to lead this discussion today. This is the second in a series of 3 panel discussions that the AIA is organizing on housing, and the next one will be Tuesday, November 9th, and I encourage you all to join us for that as well. I'll be putting the link to register for that meeting in the chat room. You all are encouraged to introduce yourself in the chat box. Keep yourself on mute unless you're actively asking a question. And with that in mind, we look forward to an engaging conversation. Rick Corsini, welcome.
Thank you, Will. We'll get right into it here. Our current housing crisis is national in scope and generations in the making. Widespread public and private exclusionary practices have limited the housing supply and racially segregated our neighborhoods, while the for-profit and non-profit housing sectors have struggled to make a dent in the enormous national housing deficit. Most first world nations treat affordable housing, along with healthcare, education, and infrastructure, as human rights and common goods that benefit society as a whole, not as commodities traded freely in the marketplace. They seek to distribute them directly or in partnership with the private sector as equitably as possible as the foundation of a decent society and competitive economy. Today in the US, we find ourselves at the nexus of 3 major interrelated crises: a national housing affordability crisis, a national racial equity crisis, and a global climate crisis. Effective responses to all 3 of these crises require major changes in the way we build our cities. Our discussion this morning will focus on the first 2. What steps at the federal and local levels are necessary to come to terms with these crises on a permanent basis? Is it time for new federal civil rights legislation to ensure all Americans have a decent place to live, near good schools, and decent jobs? I'd like now to introduce our panelists. First, Chancellor Al-Mansour is Executive Director of the Housing Rights Center. Ms. Al-Mansour has litigated hundreds of cases involving landlord-tenant, housing element, mortgage fraud, and fair housing laws, and has served as president of the Fair Housing Congress of Southern California. Ms. Al-Mansour graduated from Vassar College and the UC Davis Law School. Debbie Burkhart is National Vice President, Supportive Housing with the National Equity Fund. Ms. Burkhart has overseen the acquisition and underwriting of more than $1 billion in tax credit equity for special needs projects, including over 4,000 units of housing for homeless veterans in 15 states. She serves on the boards of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans and Corporation for Supportive Housing. She graduated from Duke University and holds an MBA and Master of City and Regional Planning from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Matthew Klesny is Senior Planner, City of Los Angeles Department of City Planning. Mr. Glesny leads the Housing Policy Unit and is responsible for the implementation of various citywide housing-related land use policies, including the city's housing element, short-term rental ordinance, and new incentive and streamlining programs for the creation and preservation of affordable housing. He holds a master's degree in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois, Chicago. Jean Slater is author of the newly published Freedom to Discriminate: How Realtors Conspired to Segregate Housing and Divide America, and is founder of CSG Advisors Incorporated. Mr. Slater has served as senior advisor on housing for federal, state, and local agencies for over 40 years. His firm is one of the nation's leading advisors on affordable housing, working in 30 states. He received degrees from Columbia, MIT, and Stanford, as well as a mid-career fellowship from Harvard. Dakshika Wikrama is Senior Deputy for Homelessness and Housing for Los Angeles City Council District 10. Ms. Wikrama oversees all policies, programs, and advocacy related to homelessness and poverty alleviation. She previously served as Senior Deputy for Homelessness and Mental Health to then Supervisor Ridley Thomas, and supported his successful efforts to pass Measure H, which funds housing and services to prevent and end homelessness in LA County. She earned her BA in English Literature from Illinois Wesleyan University and a master's in urban studies and planning from MIT. Our discussion this morning will follow a general outline. First, describing the system of exclusion and how we got here, followed by the case for housing as a civil right, and concluding with a discussion of dismantling the system and the way forward in Los Angeles. And with that, we will start with Jean.
Thank you. So Rick mentioned crises, and I think it's important because there's lots of discussion about a housing crisis in Los Angeles, in California, nationally, to distinguish two related but different kinds of crises or problems. One is a problem of overall housing costs and affordability, and the second is one of racial opportunity. And these are different, they're related, and they impact each other. So I think it's useful to pull these apart. This overall housing cost crisis, which can in turn be viewed at least in part or attempted to be solved as a housing supply problem. The more supply will limit the escalation of prices. That's the broadest meaning of a housing crisis because it affects everyone who doesn't already own a home. And for anyone who owns a home, it affects, well, what am I going to do next, or what's going to happen to my children? The lower the income, the more the impact, but it's in some ways an almost universal problem. Before the pandemic, this whole problem of the bidding up of housing costs to higher and higher percentages of disposable income was largely limited to certain metropolitan areas. Let me give you an example. In 1973, the average price of a single family home in San Francisco was $34,000. Do you know what that average price was in Buffalo, New York? It was $33,000. There was hardly any difference in average housing costs for the same kind of home throughout the United States. Since 1973, there's been this enormous divergence between high-tech, high-educated, parts of the information economy and other places. And so the problem of housing affordability was a problem of San Francisco, it was a problem of Los Angeles, become a problem of Seattle and Boston and New York, but wasn't a national problem. That bidding up, which has really been happening during the pandemic, a bidding up of demand, is now affecting the country nationally. We're dealing with 15% increases in housing costs in Montana, in Denver, in Austin. So that's the broadest meaning of housing crisis in the sense of an overall cost crisis. There's a second kind of crisis or problem, which is one of opportunities. The ability of certain people to be able to live in what the planning department for Los Angeles, I think, is effectively defined as high opportunity areas. And those opportunities have been the ability to do that has been specifically limited historically. This is a problem of racial barriers and geography. And it's a question not of how do we deal with the overall cost of housing, but how do we expand and diversify real opportunities? Now, of course, this rise in overall housing costs is affordability, of course, aggravates the opportunity problem, but it's not the same problem. And this opportunity problem, this geographic limiting of where people can live racially has been here in Los Angeles and in every other city in the country in identical ways for a century. Because as I'm going to explain, it was created by the nation's real estate boards in every city in the country. And it's existed through both tight and weak housing markets. It isn't inherently solved by what one comes up with to increase overall supply or do other things to reduce housing costs. It's its own problem. However, the same constraints that created that created and were used to racially limit opportunities, vast single-family zoning, emphasis on the needs of a narrow neighborhood rather than the entire community. Those two things that are now widely seen as driving up housing costs, there's broad consensus that needs to be addressed. So this can create a moment of leverage. In effect, this overall national housing crisis or housing affordability crisis in California can be used effectively as a moment to try to deal with the opportunity crisis. And it's that relationship between these two. So let me talk a little about the opportunity problem, the history of that, how the barriers to opportunity were created and their legacy today. Now, Los Angeles played a central role in the creation of residential segregation. I want to underline that sentence. Segregation, unlike the myths that realtors promoted for many years, segregation was neither natural nor normal nor historic in American cities. If you go back to the beginning of the 1900s, American cities were not racially segregated. People lived by where they could afford to, not by their ancestry. And so Black real estate broker in Los Angeles in 1904 proudly talked about how the Negroes of this city have prudently not segregated into any locality, but scattered and purchased homes in areas with the best services and surroundings. That was Los Angeles in 1904. By 1917, a Black Angelino said just the opposite. We've circled by invisible walls of steel, surrounded us and made it impossible to go beyond these walls. And the Los Angeles Housing Commission, one of our ancestor of our own client in the housing department, lamented in the 1910s that Mexican Americans could secure housing if only racial restrictions were not placed upon every new tract of land. So what had happened in those 13 years was the power of the creation of real estate boards, in which Los Angeles became the largest and most powerful in the country, to begin using racial restrictions, racially restricted neighborhoods to sell homes, both in new areas and in existing ones. And they created step by step these invisible walls. This required an enormous effort to limit the country's burgeoning market, free market in housing. And it required the real estate boards to organize brokers, governments, entire suburbs, lenders, appraisers, newspapers, the courts. In the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration, which the realtors staffed and drafted the redlining maps for. It required all these efforts to enforce and institutionalize segregation. But instead of trying to walk through that whole history and how it was justified, I think what stands out that's important from that history for our discussion today are a couple of things, are the key lessons from that history. First, it was the real estate industry that specifically and deliberately designed these barriers as a way to sell homes and to systematize and to enforce that. Second, that the realty boards created many of the most fundamental elements that affect real estate today as part of that effort. They created the first zoning legislation in the country in Los Angeles in 1908, and then the first single-family zoning in Berkeley in 1916, specifically in the Berkeley case, single-family zoning was created specifically to prevent Blacks from moving into an area adjoining those with racial restriction. They created the first planning regulations. City planning in America was largely a creation of real estate boards in conjunction with their efforts to create segregation. They created to enforce racial restrictions. J.C. Nichols in Kansas City, the first homeowners associations in the country that became very powerful in Los Angeles. They created separate suburban governments. These were all created by the real estate industry to complement and support racial covenants. Now, all of these elements reflected a fundamental principle that real estate boards believed was essential to real estate in cities. And it's important to understand this basic mindset because it still affects how we deal with these issues today. They believed in what they called the law of conformity that they applied in creating zoning. And the notion was that stability in real estate depended on like being with like. Buildings had to be with other buildings that were the same. Land uses had to be with other land uses that were the same. Classes had to be with other social classes that were the same. And races had to be with other races that were the same. That was their fundamental principle. And so you can see race restrictions and zoning coming out of the same idea. This law of conformity made and makes diversity the enemy. It uses nuisance law as sort of the model, that these people who would violate that minorities moving to white neighborhood, they're a nuisance. They're like polluting laundry. And this law of conformity was designed for those with the most choices to limit the choices of those with the least. And the third principle was it made the narrow subdivision the entire focus without regard to and as opposed to the metropolitan area, to the broader community as a whole, to provide a refuge from metropolitanism. Nowhere was this idea of avoiding metropolitanism more central to the creation of the city itself than Los Angeles, with ads. This is an ad for Hollywood land in the 1920s. Protect your family by procuring a home place in the hills of Hollywood land, secured by fixed restrictions, racial restrictions, against the inroads of metropolitanism, yet 25 minutes from downtown. In other words, the dream that spurred Los Angeles' growth as the fastest growing city in America was the desire to be insulated from the very idea of growth itself. That was the sort of paradox at the heart of creating a city like Los Angeles. And it was realtors from Los Angeles and California then who in subsequent decades put up the fiercest resistance to fair housing. In 1948, after the Supreme Court said courts can't enforce racial covenants, the Los Angeles Realty Board proposed a US constitutional amendment to overturn the 14th Amendment and to impose apartheid. And then on the advice of their lawyers, they said, we can do this more quietly through racial steering, a mechanism which still, despite fair housing, happens informally today. And then in the 1960s, they used a state constitutional amendment, Proposition 14 in 1964, to prohibit fair housing anywhere in California in the name of individual freedom of choice. Although it was ruled unconstitutional, that argument about freedom of choice, the freedom to zone, the freedom to control who else could live near you, pushed back fair housing in America until Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, and has permanently weakened its provisions, some of which you'll hear about today. So half a century after fair housing, it's the legacy of these institutions, the homeowners associations, the single family zoning, and these principles of conformity and of focusing on the subdivision rather than the whole community that keep the barriers in place. So as one thinks about expanding opportunities today, one has to recognize that these assumptions or principles are in many ways what underlies the issues. The impact of this legacy of limiting racial opportunity on economic mobility, on education, on health, on disparities in household wealth have only compounded these effects over the decades, making it ever harder to address these barriers at a time of higher and higher housing costs. So at the local level, what's so valuable to me about reading the Planning Department's Equitable Distribution Report is that it focuses on the geography of opportunity, and thus on the barriers to affordable housing in high opportunity areas, on where such housing is created, and what can be built through land use incentives versus limited dollars for financial subsidy. And it focuses on zoning disparities between high opportunity areas and others. So if the current crisis in housing costs, creating support for dealing with housing, can help remove some of these barriers to opportunity at the local, the state, and the national level, that will be one of the more positive ways to use this current crisis to help deal with a racial opportunity problem that's gone on for a century. Thanks. Rick, can't hear you.
You did. Thank you very much, Gene. That was very well said, and I would like to now pass this on to Chancellor.
Good morning, everybody. Chancellor Al-Mansour with the Housing Rights Center, and I hope not to be too duplicative of what you've heard, because Gene and we share a common historical perspective in looking at how Los Angeles came to be Los Angeles, how Los Angeles County came to be Los Angeles County, and we both concentrate on this area. I do as a fair housing attorney and as a civil rights attorney, and as a lifelong Californian as well, because this is my story, basically, as well. But before I kind of dive a little bit into my story, when I I talk a lot and I give a lot of webinars and presentations over the years. I've been doing this for 27 years, but especially over the last couple of years, because thankfully, since last year, there has been such a renewed interest in looking at, social justice, looking at how we came to be, why there's such a huge gap in wealth, why Black home ownership is worse than it was 50 years ago. After the Civil War, there are fewer Black families own homes than almost in our modern times, and it's getting worse. Black families, their wealth has gone down to an average of about $5,000 per household, which is much less than about the $117,000 per household that white families have. And unfortunately, we are in a crisis state right now when it comes to just the loss of housing, how it impacts us, and you see it. If you live in LA County, if you live in LA City, you see the faces of who are experiencing homelessness the most, who are the unhoused. It is oftentimes people of color, in particular Black men, Black families, veterans, and so forth. So, that's where we are. And when I kind of start talking about how we came to be, of course, you look at slavery and at the Emancipation Proclamation, but even, you're looking at Manifest Destiny in terms of the call for white Americans to come west, to settle the West, to take over the lands, to help either, not to help the people that are there, but to help themselves to the lands and to the resources that are there, and to either indenture the people that are there, or unfortunately to slaughter them if they were unwilling to help with this settlization of California. And that's kind of how we came to be. And then you fast forward, as Gene was discussing, he talked a little bit about, I don't know if he used the term redlining, but basically the maps that the US government helped to fund the homeowner loan corporation maps of 1939 that were used throughout the United States to determine where housing investment would be placed. It was either used to keep neighborhoods the way they were already racially segregated, or to create future planning as well. So in Los Angeles County, redlining maps were very well used all throughout LA City. It's why in the San Fernando Valley, Pacoima, if you know the San Fernando Valley, the Pacoima area is the only area where Black Americans were allowed to live, because that area was redlined exclusively for Blacks, and other parts of the valley, the racially restrictive covenants and exclusionary zones as well, kept them and prohibited Black households from purchasing or living in those areas. As a matter of fact, some cities went as far as like cities of like Glendale to pass sundown ordinances and sundown laws to make it where you could be criminally prosecuted if you were Black and you were in the city limits after sundown. So it wasn't even a matter of not being able to purchase a home or purchase property in cities like Glendale, San Marino, and other parts of LA County, but you could even physically be in those cities after that time. As a matter of fact, if you're familiar with the San Gabriel Valley and that part of the area, you'll see that Pasadena and parts of Altadena at least had, before a lot of the displacement we've seen in the last 15 years, but had a very significant Black population, especially around the Rose Bowl area in Northwest Pasadena. And that was because of racially restrictive covenants and sundown laws, because of all the other areas around that area had sundown laws. So Blacks couldn't live in that area. But in the area around Pasadena and the Rose Bowl, you had really wealthy white families like the Gambles and the Wrigleys, who came from the East. They were used to having Black housekeepers and maids and servants and chauffeurs be able to service them and their households. They didn't quite understand the really strong exclusionary standards that they saw Nouvelle, more recent white Californians do, in sense of like not having there. They were like, why? So as a matter of fact, that's why around the Rose Bowl, you have, and on Lincoln Boulevard, you have very small homes that Blacks were allowed to live in, and they could be within walking distance of the mansions around the Rose Bowl. Jackie Robinson's mother was a maid and owned a small home, and so forth. And he and his family, his brother, Mac Robinson, his widow, thankfully is still living, and she owns a home like kind of around that Rose Bowl area, because that way they could walk to those homes. But that was not the case in most of Los Angeles County. Most of Los Angeles County weren't as willing to even live within in the same distance as Black people. And so that created the huge white flight that we saw. As a matter of fact, as Jean was noting, in 1948, when the U.S. government and Shelley versus Kramer made it illegal to enforce racially restrictive covenants, you saw areas like in South LA. So the city of Compton in 1950, in 1920, 1930 was 99.5% white. The US Supreme Court made it illegal to enforce racial restrictive covenants in 1948. By 1950, Compton was about 50% white. By 1970, Compton was only 25% white. And so, whereas in other cities like Beverly Hills stayed about 99% white because those racial restrictive covenants were still illegally enforced. And as we've also seen, when racially restrictive covenants didn't work to keep especially Black families from purchasing homes, oftentimes localities, people turned to violence. The Ku Klux Klan was always very active and very alive and very well in all of California. I saw my first Ku Klux Klan march when I was a teenager in San Jose, California. And in the 1980s, there were several in the 1970s and 1980s to keep Black and Latinx Hispanic households and certain Asian households as well out of neighborhoods. As a matter of fact, it was World War II and the Japanese internment that created large Black homeownership in Leimert Park and in parts of mid-city LA, because even though that was predominantly white at the time and Japanese American owned homes, because of the internment, all the Japanese Americans were their homes were taken from them. White flight then went up to the San Fernando Valley, Hancock Park, Beverly Hills, and it kind of created this opportunity where Blacks of some means could purchase homes in that part of Los Angeles. And then again, fast forward to what's been in the news with the Bruce Beach case and Bruce Beach, Manhattan Beach, Black family who, not my Black family, not my family were poor sharecroppers from Louisiana and Arkansas, but this Black family had so much money they could purchase large beachfront property. The violent acts of the Ku Klux Klan didn't work to take their property away from them. And so then what happened was cities turned to eminent domain, such as that as well, to take the property away and was recently given back. And then again, fast forward to mortgage lending cases. You have to talk about how housing is financed and how the financing of housing has really just contributed to this as well. So in the last decade, you've seen multiple huge cases against Bank of America. Bank of America settled a case for $350 million of discriminatory mortgage lending cases where Black and Hispanic borrowers with better credit oftentimes than white borrowers were given worse rates and worse lending terms, or even such predatory practices where their homes were taken from them. Same thing, Wells Fargo Bank as well settled a $200 million case in 2012, and then again another case in 2015. And then I just want to kind of end by talking about the AFFH role, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act. So in fair housing advocates for years have been trying to put teeth behind the Fair Housing Act. You know, we have this great piece of legislation that makes it illegal to discriminate on the basis of housing and all types of housing. And it gives the people the right to bring private action in court, which is excellent. But the problem is that you still had decades of damage and injury that had been created by local jurisdictions, governments, as Jean and I have detailed, not just by private actors, but more impactful by government agencies and government departments. And we only touched the tip of the iceberg. I didn't talk about Chavez Ravine and all kind of other things that where government actions took away lands by people and people of color. So in 2015, HUD and under President Obama made it a final rule, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act, to say that basically that cities have a mandatory duty to affirmatively further fair housing, to address the past act of discrimination, to look at the policies and practices that they were engaging in seriousness, and to get community input as well, and to negate or to go back and to look at how neighborhoods came to be the way they were, and for cities and jurisdictions and localities to look at their own practices as well. Unfortunately, under the past administration, the AFFH rule was dismantled in 2020, it was not enforced. And surprisingly enough, it was actually the Real Estate Association. It was the National Real Estate Association and all the major lenders from Bank of America to Wells Fargo Bank who joined fair housing agencies like mine in support of the Affirmatively Furthering Housing Act, all submitting public comment and letters saying, do not dismantle the Fair Housing Act. And these are mortgage lenders. So for saying, we need this to address the past of discrimination and the historical injustice that we have engaged in ourselves. Of course, it was not listened to. As a matter of fact, President Trump famously tweeted in November that American housewives in suburbs need to protect themselves from the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act being enforced because it would open the opportunity for other people to come into their neighborhoods and do away with their nice way of life. In January 2021, under this new administration, they basically suspended the suspension of the AFFH rule, basically saying that this government is going to once again enforce the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Act. And so, as a matter of fact, under the Build Better legislation, there's more funding for affordable housing than ever before. So hopefully there will still be a lot of funding for affordable housing and housing in neighborhoods as well. But I just kind of wanted to end on a little bit of a positive note. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Chancellor. That's marvelous. And now I'd like to turn it over to Matthew Glesney, who will discuss the efforts within the City of Los Angeles Planning Department. Matt?
Yeah, thank you, Rick, and thanks to Will and the AIA. This is a great couple sessions here on really important topics. Really honored to follow Jean and Chancellor there. Great background on where we are, which is not great with regards to housing and housing opportunity, affordable housing, and the importance of housing that it plays in everyone's life, and just that history of discrimination and exclusion that resonates still today and really challenges a lot of our work. But we're going to talk a little bit about what we're up to here in the City of Los Angeles. I'm a city planner with the City of LA. I oversee our housing policy unit. And so I'll be talking a little bit about a report back about equitable distribution of affordable housing and some recommendations that came out of that, and how that ties into a current work effort, which we're very close to the finish line on, called the housing element. It's an important part of state law that does pick up a lot of these fair housing themes in new ways that I'll touch on a little bit. So we'll jump right in. I do have some slides. Not going with the flow here, hope that's okay, but I wanted to just show maybe some numbers and some maps and things like that. So let me share my screen. And yeah, I just thought I'd give a lay of the land here a little bit, just of on this piece of the puzzle, right? This is not the whole puzzle, but the creation of sort of capital A, capital H, affordable housing, deed restricted affordable housing obviously is a critical part of the solution to redress some of these past harms. Given where the market's at today, we really need to maximize the amount of deed restricted, income restricted affordable housing. It's a challenge, of course. We don't have enough funding from the federal and state levels. It's very expensive to build this housing. But here's where we are. We're seeing some encouraging trends in LA. This is just 10 years of production broken out by what we call 100% affordable projects in blue there, and then what we call mixed income, which essentially are privately developed mixed income projects, usually through the result of combination of incentives. You may have heard of density bonus or TOC here in LA. We have some other programs, and now we also have a linkage fee, which assesses an affordable housing fee on all new developments that is also pushing people much more into the world of incentives and mixed income. So the vast majority, we just pulled this number, 97% of all new housing that was subject to the linkage fee, multifamily housing, is including affordable housing. So we essentially have an inclusionary, if you want to think of it that way, where it's just become the norm in Los Angeles to build on-site affordable units. And And that's a great thing, as you can see that those numbers are increasing significantly. About almost half all affordable housing was unsubsidized, completely incentivized through this combination of carrots and sticks. And we think we can go much higher with that number. And that's a big part of our sort of going forward strategy here. So just want to give a little bit of good news. We're actually seeing these numbers even looking better in our forward-looking pipeline developments. But the not so good news is, where is this housing distributed, right? This is the second part of Jean's equation. Is it being just created in low income, high segregated poverty neighborhoods, or is it actually creating opportunity for folks to go to great schools and take advantage of great amenities and transit and all the good things in our city? So we did this analysis for the city council, and it's sobering. The kind of high level here is, and sorry, I should explain this map. This actually ties to what Chancellor was talking about with the fair housing, the AFFH, the affirmatively fair housing, which is leading to a lot of action. This is a map created by the state to map out areas that actually have those high resources, have good schools, have great opportunities for particularly lower income children to grow up and achieve good quality of life, good life outcomes. So they've really looked at, like, zip code matters, right? And so these blue and dark blue areas are those areas of high resources, high opportunities, and the grayer areas are less. And as you can see, affordable housing the last 10 years has been very focused in the low resource, in the high segregation poverty areas, about 62%, while only 14% of our affordable housing, or 1,600 units, has been in those highest resource areas, the best areas for low-income children to grow up in. So we have a lot to do, and we propose some strategies to try to improve on this. Sorry, one thing I just do want to mention on this is that there's actually a really wide difference between that mixed income and the 100% affordable. Interestingly enough, the 100% affordable is much more sort of segregated in those poverty, low resource areas. And there's a lot of reasons for that, having to do with land costs and funding sources, and just it's very difficult, but zoning is a big part of that. And then the mixed income is being more successful. So about 42% of mixed income affordable units actually are in those higher and highest resource. I think it's only about 8% of the 100% affordable. So for better, for worse, the mixed income is achieving a little bit better results in terms of distribution. Okay, so what are we going to do about this here in Los Angeles, guys? We pointed to some recommendations that coincide with some opportunities having to do with this housing element update, which is this state required every 8-year process that every city in Southern California is getting to the finish line right now. Southern California is, their housing elements were due October 15th. We're a little bit late, but there's a grace period. We'll think we'll be okay. But certainly this is on the top of mind of a lot of planners around Southern California right now. And it's really been a kind of a paper law. It's not been terribly effective, obviously, given where we are today in California, but it's been recently strengthened quite a bit. Not only on fair housing grounds to include those affirmatively fair housing requirements that Chancellor talked about in the housing element, to make sure all the housing programs are sort of taking down exclusion and segregation and really taking proactive steps to do that. But it's also, the numbers have gotten a little higher. So this law is really about cities doing their fair share. It really comes out of the fair housing movement in the 60s to say that cities can't just build a wall and say, we're not interested in affordable housing, we're not interested in multifamily housing in our community. They actually have to plan for their growth. And again, it's been a bit of a paper exercise, and folks, there hasn't been a lot of action, I would say, coming out of it, but I think you're going to see some changes this cycle, particularly here in LA. Our number was, we had a housing goal of 500,000 units, essentially, here in the city of LA. That was about 5 times higher than before. We found we didn't have enough land to accommodate that amount of housing units. We don't have enough zoning capacity. So we are being forced to do some rezoning. And that's what's called this RENA rezoning program here. That's, I think, an important opportunity to kind of rectify this distribution issue. And so we are bringing forward what we're calling an equitable rezoning program that would create capacity for at least 250,000 units, but we've presented a plan for 1.3 million units. And we've set a goal with the city council that the majority of that would actually be in those blue highest resource areas of the city. That doesn't mean that all the housing is going to go there. We still have lots of zoning in our central core transit-rich areas, but we really want to take this opportunity to shift and redress some of those harms. So that's a big opportunity that we've put forward, kind of a plan, a blueprint, if you will, and we have 3 years to sort of carry that out. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the other big recommendations here is, look, our policies goals in our general plan and how we do housing and land use is outdated. It needs an update, and we took this opportunity to refresh and make sure equity was at the forefront of all of our housing policies. And so this is a pretty comprehensive update. It's just a policy document, so it doesn't necessarily change things overnight here, but really I think we're starting to shift away from a very kind of preservation of single family framework, only grow housing near transit and jobs, to making sure that equity is that kind of third leg. So jobs, transit, equity. We need to make sure equity is at the forefront of how we plan for new housing in LA, and have really comprehensively changed the goals and policies of the city to start to reflect that, we hope. That also means programs to eliminate barriers that we know exist for affordable housing. We know wealthy folks use those tools like appeals and CEQA and denials and risk that really make affordable housing riskier and costlier in areas. We need to do what we can at the city to streamline good affordable housing priority developments if they're meeting all the rules. And so that's a big component of the 8-year plan here as well. And then I wanted to highlight lastly here what we think is a pretty transformational idea. It's again a bit of a medium term, but the idea would really be to change the way we do planning here in LA. Today, we do planning by each community plan area, 35 plan areas in the city, neighborhood by neighborhood. That started in the 60s. And interestingly enough, most neighborhoods aren't interested very much in wanting to upzone and rezone. And so there hasn't been a lot of pressure through that process to do that. We've basically been just keeping pace with our population growth projections through those plan updates without, I would say, a real citywide policy focus about what do we want to do as a city? How do we want to grow as a city? What areas should grow and what areas shouldn't? And so we really want to have that conversation and make sure that when we do our local updates at the plan level, at the community level, that it's really informed by these citywide objectives. And the idea here is to sort of take our citywide number, or that 500,000 number, or whatever it is, and thoughtfully, intentionally distribute that number across the city in a way that reflects our values around equity and sustainability. And that means that basically it's a formula, putting in factors that we think are important as a city, and those become the targets that each plan area would be responsible for figuring out how to do at a local level still. But there would be a goal that is set with equity in mind and sort of redress of some of these historical harms in mind. And it would be an intentional equity-focused strategy. So those are sort of the big ideas coming out of the housing element. I don't want to spend too much time here, but this is sort of more detail on that 1.3 million rezoning idea over the next 3 years. Again, this is going to occur over a variety of ways, including community plan updates, including updates to our density bonus and TOC and incentive programs, including adaptive reuse ordinances and more ADUs and more missing middle. But again, the majority focused in those high resource, high opportunity areas of the city. And so we're focusing on corridors, right? Underutilized corridors is a low-hanging fruit. So we call them opportunity corridors in high opportunity, West Side, South Valley, Northwest Valley areas of the city, maximizing these incentive programs, getting more out of them, creating an affordable housing overlay. This is kind of a big idea. If you are doing affordable housing, mostly affordable housing, maybe 50-50, maybe 100, we don't know yet. But if you're doing a mostly affordable housing project, we're going to give you much more places to build where you're not competing with the market rate people. So this is an exciting idea. Faith-based organizations, church parking lots, mosques, synagogues that are not zoned for affordable housing. We want to make it easy and many more places like that. Expand missing middle, more naturally affordable, duplex, triplex, bungalow courts, all that good stuff. Going back to our history, commercial areas, adaptive reuse, micro units, a lot of ideas there, parking zones, a lot of good ideas from AIA, by the way, from your advocacy. And just wanted to plug this story map. If you're interested in digging around, we've got a great map you can play around a little bit. And finally, just close by showing this is kind of the results. So this is on the left, the map. Am I still sharing? My screen got, sorry, I got tossed around here. Are we still good?
We're
Is it
still sharing.
Yes, yeah,
That's
we're
great.
still
Wonderful.
sharing.
I just
Yes.
lost my screen. Okay. Trusting you can see it. So the map on the left is our current zoning capacity, basically very centralized in the core of the city. Where can you build multifamily housing? It's very centralized in the core of the city. Our rezoning strategy for 1.3 million, as you can see on the right, is much more distributed across the city. So just wanted to show that that kind of what we're calling fixing for those past errors, regressing. We're not abandoning the core of the city. It needs investment too, but we know we need to do a lot more in other areas of the city that have not really done their fair share, and that really developed as a result of these racist policies of the past that Gene and Chancellor so eloquently talked about. So I'll leave it there. But again, thanks for the opportunity. Thanks so much. Bye.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. That's great. And it's great to see that the City of Los Angeles Planning Department seems to have a coherent plan to address all these critical issues. So I'd like to now bring Dakshika on to discuss potential issues of implementation in this case, and what it looks like politically to accomplish some of these positive goals.
Thank you, Rick. And just carrying on a theme, I think that has from Jean to Chancellor and Matt around equity and how you implement things with equity in mind. I'm going to zoom out for a little bit and then zoom back into LA, but also wanted to mention that the housing element is such an important kind of visioning document with kind of opportunities to implement in a fair and equitable way. One of the things in our office we're thinking about is really that political will within the city elected officers, but also how that then ripples out as a citywide kind of thought process around how this could get implemented. So one of the things our office did when we first came to the city in December 2020 is put forward a motion to really explore and establish a right to housing in LA City. So this connects to what Matt was talking about, but also goes deeper in some aspects, especially when it comes to the folks who are unhoused and unsheltered in our city. So just to go back to kind of provide the history of a right to housing in the United States. Some people may not realize that really it was the President FDR in his second address to Congress, what was called the Second Bill of Rights, that really brought up this right to housing. And while it did not get a lot of traction in the United States, it did create the Fair Housing Act. But you've seen from Jean and Chancellor how the Fair Housing Act was also kind of subverted in some ways to not do all that it could have. Eleanor took the idea, and this is where you have the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, which includes right to housing. So people may not realize that it really came from the United States, but was not really embraced here. But then because of Eleanor's work, the United Nations really took that on. And right to housing, as you know, has a lot of work being done at the international level. So you have Scotland has a right to housing and South Africa has a right to housing. So the reason my boss felt a right to housing in LA City was important, he does not think about it as in philosophical terms. He really thinks of it as a very concrete thing, because if you think about the Voting Rights Act, for example, sure, it's under attack, as you know, has been for a long time, but it really mandates local jurisdictions throughout the nation to put forward the resources to make sure people can vote. And so that did not happen overnight. If you go back and look at the voting rights legislature, they did not have the resources to make sure everybody had access to vote in the beginning. You know what a big struggle it was. But over the years, progressively, the resources are put forward to make voting rights something that everybody has access to. Even when it is under attack, there's always kind of a mandate to provide information about how to vote and access to vote. So this is why my boss really felt it was important, not only philosophically, but as a policy platform to establish housing as a right in LA City, because once you have a legal mandate, then the resources line up, and then you have to think through, of course, the equitable distribution of those resources. But wanted to make sure you understood why the LA city is now exploring. It was approved in March 2021, and we are now in the report back period, but it's very much connected to the housing element, but it drills down deeper into the folks who are, unhoused and unsheltered. I will say that at the state level, there have been some movements to do a right to housing. Then Assemblymember Rob Bonta, just before the pandemic, tried to put forward a bill to establish a right to housing at the state, but then the pandemic happened, as you know. And then I will also say that the governor's task force, Governor Newsom's task force that was co-chaired by Mayor Darrell Steinberg of Sacramento, and then Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas also put forward a 40-point plan, including a right to housing and different ways to equitably provide housing throughout California. The hesitancy to really do anything at the state really boils down to a fear of lack of resources. But this is where you have to really balance a mandate with resources and create this progressive action plan. So at the city level, just to let you know, we are working with the Corporation for Supportive Housing and Shelter Partnership and the LA Housing Department, it's now called the LA Housing Department once again at the city, to come up with a 5-year investment strategy around 4 components. Prevention, and that talks about a lot of the things Matthew was talking about around affordable housing, but also talks about eviction defense and some of the fair housing pieces around equitable access to high opportunity areas, even if you have a Section 8. So at the state level, just making sure you guys know it is now illegal to not rent a unit in California just because of your source of income, meaning just because you have a Section 8 in the past, landlords would not rent you, and that is now illegal in California. But as Chancellor will say, enforcement of that is also very tricky. But these are the kinds of things around prevention that we're looking at over the next 5 years to really increasing investment around a right to counsel so that everybody has access to counsel if they're being evicted, as well as really building up the affordable housing portfolio across the city. So that's one component, prevention. The second component is interim housing, because if you look at people who are unhoused, sometimes they have additional needs, mental health needs, behavioral health needs, medical needs. So we have done some analysis, the Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority, as well as the Department of Health Services and the Department of Mental Health have done some analyses connected to their alternatives to incarceration work, as well as all the work going on in the homeless initiative. What kind of next 5-year strategy is needed to really increase specialized interim housing beds? So for example, imagine if you go into a hospital and you have surgery, but you don't have a place to live. You live on the street. Now, you and I can go home and recover. And so the county is building up this whole portfolio, what is called recuperative care beds, where people can step down from a hospital bed to an interim housing bed with a lot of nursing care, as well as housing navigation to connect them to affordable housing and supportive housing. So that's just one example around the second component, which is interim housing, and how we scale that up over the next 5 years. The third component, of course, the biggest component, is permanent affordable housing. So that really looks at not only supportive housing for the folks who need long-term rental assistance and long-term supportive care and case management and connect to community-based services, but also looks at what people may have heard, rapid rehousing, which is a 2-year rental assistance subsidy, as well as Section 8, which is a long-term rental subsidy, as well as some opportunities to do what is called shallow subsidies. So if you're a senior and you have been placed in a rental assistance unit, sometimes you may still have a small gap, like a $200 gap, to really make ends meet. So we are really testing, especially with the senior homeless population, shallow subsidies. So that's the third component around right to housing. The last component, and the component that is most difficult sometimes to really implement, is the street engagement strategy. And even though these 4 components, I'm talking about them separately, obviously they all connect, because street engagement teams can go out into the city and connect with people, engage with them, but they then need an interim housing placement or a permanent housing placement to make sure they have places to put them. And on the prevention side, as we house more people, we want to make sure you turn off the faucet so that more people aren't falling in. So just one piece of data, in 2019, the annual data showed that every day LA County was exiting 207 people from homelessness, but unfortunately 227 people were falling in. So what you see is, in spite of the massive amount of work being done to house people, more people are falling in because of some of the things we've been talking about. So that 5-year investment strategy is being crafted right now with the help of the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and then Shelter Partnership, another nonprofit, will be doing focus groups with the 5-year investment strategy to really vet the numbers and the strategy with stakeholders in the community, including we've already done a focus group with people with lived experience. So we want to really make sure that this is grounded in the experience of people who are experiencing homelessness and who have gone through the system and can tell us where things are working and where things are not working. I will also add that at the federal level, you're seeing some language around right to housing. We still have to wait and see how this gets operationalized. President Biden tweeted earlier this year that housing should be a right, and Secretary Marsha Fudge, the new Secretary of HUD, also tweeted that, housing assistance should be a universal right, not a discretionary kind of action. So the Build Back Better initiative has some investments, more than ever before, in rental assistance and affordable housing production. But of course, we need much more. And hopefully this will pass through so that we can use those federal resources in alignment with state resources and our local resources to think about this 5-year investment strategy to establish a right to housing. And the housing element, as I said, will be a big piece of this, but this will be a more drill down version of a strategy to really look at the unhoused population. So I'll stop there, and I know Deb will also carry on the theme around the resource piece, and looking forward to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dakshika. And now we'll turn it over to Deb. Of course, we have to end with the discussion about money and funding.
Yes, it always comes down to money. Well, I want to start with a little bit of good news and tying it into what Jean and Chancellor had talked about in terms of, like, back in 1948, racial covenants were made illegal. But it took until 2021 for AB 721 to eliminate the last vestige of barriers in high opportunity areas to build affordable housing and supportive housing. I work for a nonprofit equity fund that syndicates low-income housing tax credits. I work with a lot of nonprofit housing providers building permanent supportive housing for homeless people. And one of my clients in Santa Monica, the Community Corporation of Santa Monica, had an opportunity in Westchester, which is a high opportunity location where it had 15% of the highest income. It's one of the 15% highest incomes in America. But there are properties there that, despite local zoning would allow more density, there was a vestigial provision arbitrarily limiting density by private agreement. And we couldn't get title insurance. We had our own general counsel look at this. And so there are moments where we're surprised that we think we're in an environment of understanding and lack of, that these disparities have been eliminated, but we have to look closer. And so now this law, this bill, AB 721, was turned into law. And now we're able to, in high opportunity areas that may have this limiting language around density, that was just all by private agreement, will allow 100% affordable or permanent supportive housing to be built on these lots. So that's an example of of the lessons that we've been hearing on this call about changes. We need to look more closely, as Matt had mentioned, at what exists, in city planning, mapping, but at the same time, I want to highlight that there is no magic bullet, and I love Dashika's explanation of the 4 steps, because we need to look at this problem holistically. We can't expect just making changes in one area, like adding a lot of new money with HHH and looking over at zoning changes like AB 721. We need to have a coordinated strategy, and it's helpful. Like we're having these discussions today. Build Back Better will provide new resources, particularly in an area that's near and dear to me is in rental subsidies. We really have a balancing act when we build affordable housing. We have to find creative ways to use empty lots and vacant parcels, change the zoning laws to allow higher density and to build near transit. But also, we need to get back to the pre-Reagan commitment to building public housing and expanding rental assistance, because it's a 3-legged stool. You can't build permanent supportive housing if you don't have long-term rental subsidies. And if you don't have service dollars, yeah, you could provide 100% grant funds and build empty buildings, but you can't operate it because the people have very low income. We have not seen much of an increase even in veteran service-connected disability payments. And so, and despite even a real estate tax exemption for our nonprofit developers, we still can't keep the lights on in these buildings unless we have long-term rental opportunities. And this is what brings me to the point of lack of sometimes vision to look, people at the legislature approve one side of the equation, one leg of the 3-legged stool. And for instance, Project Home Key, wonderful, $600 million came to the state, and the county and the city provided another $78 million. And we quickly, got 8 properties under contract, but we don't have much in terms of rental subsidies to open these properties. And the Home Key dollars, even as I said, if we still have a little bit of a gap, if we could put on a little bit of private debt, conventional debt, that is leveraged by rent subsidies, then we would be able to, open up tomorrow several properties that just need light rehab. And you would say, whoa, what about those emergency housing vouchers? Well, those emergency housing vouchers are tenant-based rental subsidies that are allocated to homeless people or people who are coming out of interim housing and coming out of the Project Room Key situations. But there's no coordinated effort to attach them to the building. So it's not a financeable tool. There's no way you can finance. And also, it's only a 5-year subsidy. So this is what is the disconnect. You get Project Home Key dollars, and soon we're going to have Home ARP dollars, where you have to serve people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness for 55 years. Oh, but hey, nonprofit developer or no for-profit, they say, hey, we got you covered. We got a coordinated entry system, which is, oh yeah, very quick at sending people. We're going to get the coordinated entry system to send over tenants with these emergency vouchers. But homeless people turn over because it takes time to stabilize people. And so situations like this, when we have a lot of money coming out of problem, but we don't sit down and talk about hey, let's take some of this money and make it a project-based rental subsidy source so that we can take advantage of this change in law that, oh, I can build in Westchester now. I can do a high opportunity development with 100% permanent supportive housing, but I'm lacking that last piece of the puzzle. And that's what this is all about, putting everything together and making the rules of these various programs work well together. And getting back to what Dashika had said about the right to housing, in permanent supportive housing, there's a lot of evidence that housing first works. That means providing housing, then services. If people can't get their basic need covered, their lizard brain won't turn off. You can't expect someone who's homeless to think about a resume and job training until they get their basic need covered, which is housing. Then the services can follow. And then the recovery can help. And then we can break the cycle of homelessness. So that's what my last point here is. We don't have a magic bullet, but we do have roadmaps and we do have partnerships. And I think we can come together. We just need to take the time to talk to each other about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. That was fantastic. You know, it's interesting, Deb, following on your comments, I was images of the destruction of Pruitt-Igoe come to mind when you're discussing this. And research after that destruction really pointed out that the destruction of that housing project was not really a failure of architectural design or urban planning. It was really a failure of the support system of how that property was managed and how the inhabitants had or lacked opportunity to develop their communities in that way. So I think that's a super critical point of view. At this point, I would like to talk about the way forward with all this. It seems to me that on this panel and within the among the community of professionals who handle and address these issues, there are very clear strategies that people seem to have, and there is a game plan, as we can see with Matt and the city planning department, even within the city of Los Angeles, a very well thought through strategy for addressing these issues comprehensively. For me, the biggest question is, how do we implement this politically? And how do we make inroads within those high opportunity areas and actually find a way to execute these important ideas? I'm wondering if we could who would like to address that among the panel?
Since you referenced the city planning strategies, I could maybe start off. But you're right. There's a reason that sort of we've landed where we are, and a lot of that has to do with politics. And there is going to be resistance to changes to neighborhoods. And I think our job is to be sensitive and like really be thoughtful about when we're proposing changes. But also, I think, a couple things helped, right? Like, so state law helps actually in this regard. This is, there's always this battle of is the state going too far? But I actually do think that the housing element and the RENA process combined with fair housing requirements could be an effective tool. And I think that's what we're trying to do in Los Angeles, to say that we have 3 years, we have to do this, or there are significant consequences, and we have to do it in a way that's fair. And so as we inevitably encounter resistance, I think we're going to continue to point back to those commitments under state law and make sure that we don't, we have that stick sort of behind us. You don't want to get in trouble. I think that helps. But there's obviously a moral case here. There's an ethical case here. I think we knew this was going to be challenging. This is part of why we brought these strategies actually to City Council over the summer. We really wanted political buy-off from all 15 members that, okay, guys, we're doing this. We need all in. We need all together. Are we okay with this? Because we know decisions are often made local at a local district level, and we really think this is a citywide issue, and we wanted to have a citywide conversation about it, and hopefully that helps. Not to say it's all going to be rosy and easy from here on out, but I think there's this combination of carrots and sticks from the state, having this mandate time, having these fair housing requirements. When people start to backtrack, no, we need the majority to be in these areas. That's our bottom line commitment. There can be adjustments to these rezonings, there can be refinements, but the overall eye on the prize of an equitable rezoning is something we really hope the city can commit to and will commit to. So thanks.
I'm wondering what happens in terms of funding How far can we go in the city of Los Angeles towards all these goals without state and federal funding, and or a state? We have more or less a state mandate. How necessary is having a federal mandate to accomplish all these goals?
I mean, I think, Rick, as Deb mentioned, and I kind of intimated, some of this is kind of, and Jean and Chancellor also kind of brought this up. Before 1980s, you didn't have families living with their children in cars. The parents going to work, the children going to school, but their default affordable housing is a vehicle. And that's because the federal government was funding a lot of this then. And so what has happened is, in the 80s, with Ronald Reagan's tax reform for the wealthy at that point, revenue went away and they cut the budget at the HUD, at the Housing and Urban Development Department. So you had this retreat by the federal government. So to answer your question, yes, I think it's critical that the federal government continue to step up and replenish the coffers when it comes to affordable housing. Even on production, if you talk to nonprofit developers, what the average person doesn't realize, it's like having to pursue 7 mortgages for your house. Imagine if you had to do that. But nonprofit developers, because they don't have one source of funding, have to pursue 7 lines of financing and line it up somehow without incurring brain damage, maybe a little bit of brain damage. But so you have this situation because you have not enough financing from one source. So I think, to answer your question, yes, I think to really climb out of this hole we are in, and I think Jean said a crisis can be an opportunity. So I think you do know federal dollars for sure ramped up, but on the crisis can be an opportunity. I think one of the things is you can use data sometimes to really speak to self-interest. So even in the high opportunity areas, what a Luskin study shows is people making even $150,000 a year feel that they fear becoming homeless because of the cost of housing. So I think we need to really provide more information on the churn because of the lack of housing supply or lack of housing opportunity because of we are living in a high rent, low income area. So I think these kinds of things will helpfully help the political aspect. And when I say political aspect, I think the elected officials are on board. It's really the communities. That's when I mean political aspect around getting the neighborhoods on board.
Let me take a slightly contrarian point of view. I've worked on $90 billion of housing financing for low-income housing, and so obviously money and subsidies is crucial, but I don't think those resources are going to come in. I mean, if I know the last 40 years, I can predict the next 40 years will come in various waves and crises and different times and in different sources and in different flavors. So they're essential, but this shouldn't diminish from the work, the critical nature of the work, the zoning work that the city is engaged in, and this replanning and these initiatives. First of all, partly because that zoning work makes physically possible many of the developments that need financing. But even more important, things that are done using the zoning powers with affordability incentives, right? For mixed income affordable or bonus densities or other things that can be done as of right, it may not be the deepest affordability, which we need other resources to achieve, but it's a critical tool in both dealing with affordability overall, the overall affordability issue, but dealing with these barriers to the geography of opportunity. So while the resources, the financial resources are necessary and need to be plugged in different ways, what the city is now trying to do in moving this forward from a zoning and planning and regulation point of view is essential on its own, whatever level, whatever exactly gets put in the Build America Better program, or whatever comes next year, or whatever comes from state. It's essential on its own to be able, as of right, to create more affordable units at some level of affordability. That's really essential.
And I don't think we're disagreeing with you,
Right.
Jean. We're saying that it's one piece of the puzzle. And I think that it hasn't had enough attention. And just by seeing this situation with the AB 721 is just that, oh, wow, we never really took a look at what the negative was of oh, we thought we should fix everything with outline racial segregation. But while I really do disagree with saying that like resources come and go and has different flavors, because we have not seen a substantial increase in the Section 8 program.
No, I know.
And like that is like, we're running out of subsidies in the
Yes.
county and the city right now. And we are the homeless capital of the United States, and we shouldn't be running out. So
Right, I didn't mean to diminish the problem. I just want us to not lose focus, whatever the
No,
resources are, that we do something on the
well,
regulatory
I think the zoning is a very efficient tool that we have not done a deeper dive on. So I definitely agree with that. You know, and like we need to look at ways to address this crisis where we can't always look to like solve it with money. And I also agree with that. I just think that we haven't been efficient with, well, it's great that we're doing a deeper dive on the legal side and the resources, but also when we do get resources, we have to be careful about the income, rent, and targeting restrictions, and that we make sure that, okay, you know, you have one source of financing for 55 years with restrictions. Why can't we let it go up to 50% of AMI if the federal government lets us down, like it has in the past, and not giving us more Section 8? Why do we have to stay for homeless? Why can't we just make it to 50% of AMI? You know, and because in high opportunity areas, yeah, the rents will be high enough to amortize a little bit of debt. That's all. That's what I'm frustrated. Yeah.
So I have now I kind of wanted to take another stab at the issues politically here locally and what we may be facing in terms of implementing the upzoning that Matt is talking about for 1.3 million new housing units citywide, focused on high opportunity zones. To me, that seems like a civil rights battle, like the late 60s and early 70s, integrating the South. And I want to understand or hear everyone's comments here about what we think it's going to take to accomplish that upzoning in the service of the strategies that city planning is proposing. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I was going to defer to Matt, but I think one of the things when our office talks to community members, when you try to cite, for example, supportive housing, you know, you have opposition because people don't like change. You know, they are afraid of change. And sometimes what has helped is having community members from another neighborhood where supportive housing has been built, and they can talk about how it didn't cause a spike in crime. It didn't cause XYZ. In fact, in certain neighborhoods, it actually added value to the neighborhood, because a lot of these supportive housing projects, and I'm talking supportive housing right now, but also a lot of mixed income projects with that nonprofit developers and for-profit developers are building in collaboration with multiple partners, because that's what it takes. Are very high quality buildings, which take into account amenities in the neighborhood and within the building. So that's one way to really provide people an idea of what it's going to look like, which I know people do all the time. But I think beyond that, on the upzoning, I think sometimes people think about, oh my goodness, there's going to be a 12-story tower next to me. And that's not what upzoning is necessarily. It's like adding a quadruplex in a single family neighborhood. It's adding ADUs in people's backyards. So I think there are some entities already doing this. And Matt, I don't know if the planning department works with them, that allows people to vision what various types of zoning could look like in their neighborhood. I know SciArc was doing some of these things when I talked to them about 2 years ago, but I think these are the kinds of things that will help people realize that actually, as it's going to be a very lovely neighborhood. It's not going to be all single family homes necessarily, but it's not going to be like a skyscraper next to, which is some of the kind of the demonization of zoning sometimes.
Yeah, and maybe just along those lines, I think, people think it's all going to happen at once, and change is really slow. One of the things we found through the housing element is, it's like there's like a 1% chance of any site, even if it is zoned for multifamily housing, of actually turning over into housing once you've rezoned it. And so it's not going to be a radical transformation. It's property has to sell, and then that's one by one by one, and it's a relatively slower process. So it's not going to be a radical change. I think that's and it's not going to be a negative change. And I think that's the other part is like ensuring the public that when we do an upzoning, that it's done in a way that captures the most community benefits as possible. We use this term value capture, and we really think there is a way to when you go from here and you allow a little bit more capacity to make sure that you can get those first of all more affordability. You can do better, take care of tenants better. You can make rights to return. You can add deeper affordability. You can have more mixed in. I think there's a lot of community benefits, more sustainability, transit passes, solar roof. Like we're thinking we can do a lot of things. We're going to model a lot of things that we can like actually couple that it's we're hitting what we think are important values for Angelenos, which is we need to maximize affordable housing. We want to do this in a sustainable green way. We want to like transform many of our ugly city streets, right? I think there actually is a lot of consensus on the corridors that we can do better there. And so that's part of it too, is like focusing on low hanging fruit before we go in and start being just too terribly disruptive in people's areas. So it's a combination of a lot of things, but it's certainly a challenge that planners face every day. And there's lots of folks doing good work to try to bring people along. And a lot of folks, I would say the tenor of the city has changed. Just in my 10, 15 years in terms of these conversations, people seeing the equity, people seeing the sustainability benefits, realizing we're a very large city and we've run out of room and we need to make some hard decisions, but we can do this in a way through good planning.
A couple of things I would throw on to that. I totally agree with both of these comments. Is Matt, I liked your image and I was just picturing physically how to do this. The change will be gradual. That maybe would be helpful rather than simply a zoning map showing here's it is now, and here's like it's all zoned this way as though it's all going to be built now, but showing here's a projection 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now of how much of these areas will be single family. I mean, you don't have to do this at the street level, but at the neighborhood level, just what percentage or something showing that how gradual this is. If you look out even 10 or 20 years, because people's time frame, they don't expect to live in their home, on average more than, 8 or 9 years or whatever. So I think such maps might be those projection maps might be very helpful. The other thing we found useful, I'm thinking about when we designed this $580 million GO bond issue for affordable housing in Alameda County, in an area, and got support across 2/3 vote across many different parts of the county, was of linking it to people's concerns about what's going to happen to them and to their children. So even if you're living in a single family, where are your children going to live 20 years from now? And that the perspective, the solution to that has to involve gradual change, both at the neighborhood level, but a citywide perspective. So I think those are, you guys know this better than anybody, but I think those can be, and Chika's point of view, very effective has been showing photographs of actual affordable housing, mixed income developments in other neighborhoods, so that every time you're presenting an idea, you show an image of what this really looks like. Because I think taking those tours, showing those photographs, affordable housing in many ways is by far the nicest housing that's being built in many neighborhoods. And so physically showing that is very important.
Yes, and I would add to this is that, and Jean, you used the term or quoted the term of, fear of metropolitanism, I think, in the early advertising for segregation. I think a very important part of this is selling metropolitanism again to Angelenos. I mean, and it shouldn't just be isolated to the excellence of an individual affordable housing project, which they generally tend to be, but to look at the overall benefit of a working urban neighborhood in terms of its walkability, the quality of the streets, and the facilities of parks and landscaping and schools in that neighborhood. So I think there needs to be, for lack of a better word, let's talk about an urban propaganda campaign here to really sell the idea of urbanism to Angelenos that would go hand in hand with what city planning is proposing.
And can I just say one fear of that, though, because that's probably what's been happening, at least for millennials and people under the age of 40 for the last 15 years, is going back to urbanization and so forth. But that is what has really intensified gentrification and displacement of Black and brown communities also. Whenever you bring in public transit, all those things you're talking about, and so forth, improving the community, oftentimes it's not the in-place community that benefits from those improvements. Especially, one of the biggest criticisms about upzoning is that it drives up housing prices, it drives up housing costs, and makes those areas unaffordable for those communities, and does exactly what Jean just said. A lot of people who have young adult children, like I do, we know the sad part is that our children could never afford to purchase a home in California, and they're all looking to move elsewhere. And so, there's so many of us who, we're in the stage of we may be fortunate to be homeowners. My husband and I, we were able to get a home in Eagle Rock, even though we faced extreme discrimination and extreme racism in getting our home. We had to basically lie in order to get our home and so forth, and it caused extreme disruption in our neighborhood. As we were the Black family coming into our neighborhood. And this is in the late 1990s and so forth. So I just want to kind of highlight that there is a concern that you have to have really strong inclusionary housing ordinances, linkage fees, even such things. I sued the city of Pasadena 20 years ago when it didn't have a housing element. And worked on, and one of the things we did as part of my lawsuit was to get the city of Pasadena to pass an inclusionary housing ordinance. And in it did provide for linkage fees, saying that if the developer didn't have to do on-site low-income housing development, but if all the new housing had to be created within a 1 to 3 mile zone of the original housing. So it didn't concentrate the affordable housing in already overly concentrated, under-resourced neighborhoods, further exacerbating those neighborhoods and creating the opportunity for further displacement, because then those housing prices are so dilapidated and so forth that it allows for, it opens up those areas for displacement, which is what we've seen in a lot of metropolitan areas from Oakland, San Francisco, Washington, DC, Brooklyn, Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, all going through. You walk around and go into these towns, and the biggest thing that people ask me when they come to Los Angeles is, where'd the Black people go? You go to San Francisco, it's where'd the Black people go? You don't see Black people anymore. Oakland right now is less than 13% Black home ownership, and so forth. It's and when I have time, I always talk about my personal story, because my family was directly impacted by this as well. And just one quick thing I just want to say, going back to we're here, the thing I forgot to talk about was that really hurt us. A lot of it goes back to World War II. I talked a little bit, I wish I could talk more about the Japanese internment and how their homes were taken away from them. And it did create some homeownership opportunity for Black families because of that really horrific situation. But also the GI Bill. The GI Bill, which was denied, over 1.2 million Black veterans were denied homeownership under the GI Bill. That same bill, which created so much homeownership and wealth for white American households, and really contributed to where we got now. So I just wanted to highlight one last thing that really contributed, especially in Los Angeles and California, was the GI Bill as well. But again, you look at upzoning, it's very important for affordable housing, but you have to protect the communities that are already there.
Great. Thank you so much, Chancellor. Well, we've reached our time, and what I'd like to do now, thank you to all the panelists. I would like to just ask for closing comments from the panelists, and we will get on with our day.
Any order? You want me to just jump in?
Jean, you want to start?
Yeah, I would say two things I was thinking of. That equity has a term, you know, in terms of housing and racial equity, has an appeal in itself. But beyond equity, there's two other phrases that I think are important in thinking about this. One is, and this was very successful when I led citizen-based efforts that led to inclusionary housing in San Francisco across a wide range of opposite groups, real estate interests on the one hand, tenants on the other, neighborhood groups, was the value of maintaining diversity in a city, and diversity in a city that's facing an affordability crisis. That diversity, where the different kinds of people are necessary to city going to be able to live, that proved to be a very helpful way of phrasing it. And the second thing is the history of these exclusionary efforts used the words freedom and freedom of choice to mean the right of somebody to exclude, really meant the freedom to exclude. And I think what's at issue here, the right has largely monopolized the idea of freedom in this country over the last 50 years, but that was the essence of the civil rights movement. And I think the notion that the issues we're dealing with about overcoming the barriers to racial opportunity are about freedom. They're actually about freedom to choose. They're about the freedom to be able to find a house, the freedom to be able to find a place for your kids. So I think freedom should not be given up on by those who are trying to promote inclusion. It's inclusionary freedom. It's the freedom to be able to find a place, not simply the freedom to exclude people, but I think it's important to bring that up as a positive framing.
Thank you. Dakshika, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think I like that, Jean, and I think this is why we have really tried to push forward housing as a right. And so whether that means establishing it by right or making it kind of codified in the city law policies, but also fiscally and through the zoning and housing element. Because I think it should be seen, and this is what the panel is talking about, a civil right, because it is something about if you are a resident in LA City, who has kind of a right to live here and where do they have a right to live and what are the resources and opportunities they have to really afford to live here. And I think what Chancellor said though is so important because you have seen over the arc of the previous decades how something that is intended to do good things can, through all the interest groups, be subverted for their own interests. So I think the city has to be very cognizant of that, and Matt and his team, when he's working on kind of the goals for each neighborhood, really look at, because I know people use this word gentrification, but more than that, it's like, how do you avoid displacement? So how do you really look at who's living there? How do you have a net gain in affordable housing? How do you have a net gain even in kind of neighborhood-based local commercial versus kind of chain restaurants coming in? So I think that's part of kind of the fabric of having, I think Rick, you mentioned is a heterogeneous, diverse, you know, Jean is a different way of saying diverse, like how do you really build heterogeneous, thriving communities? So I would just say, make it a right, but also really make sure that you don't have this things eroding at the bottom that you're not even aware of.
Great, thank you, Dakshika. And now, Deb, would you like to add a closing
I
remark?
just want to echo the right to housing, and I hope that the state legislature gets to that point of for California, like New York State as well, has a right to housing. And it is a concern on the resources side, but just to, as a reiterating, it's not just about adding new programs and new sources of funds, it's taking the existing resources And affordable housing finance is how to use existing resources and make them more efficient. And we can go back and make more flexibility in the rules so that they combine better with federal resources like the low-income housing tax credit or any new funds that come through the home ARP program. But I don't think we can stand by and wait to enforce, to allow the statement right to housing. It should be more, a fixture in our state rather than just a concept.
Okay. And
I just want to throw in, because I know time is short. Yes, definitely. Housing has to be seen as a right. It has to be. In addition to that, right to counsel as well, to protect the rights of tenants, to have free representation in eviction court, because tenants, when they go to court, they lose, even if they have great cases. And who's most impacted by evictions are Black women and Black households are the groups that are most impacted by evictions, many times, oftentimes by no fault of their own. And then also by enforcing the Fair Housing Act, the Community Reinvestment Act as well, which has very strong anti-discrimination provisions and puts the requirement on financial institutions that they support and invest in affordable housing. So I would say, going back to the federal resources that we have, really strongly supporting them and making sure that they are never targeted again for dismantling.
great. Thank you, Chancellor. And Matthew, would you like to wrap it up?
I'm terrible at these wrap ups, but I just want to say thank you. This has been wonderful. Love learning and listening to all the colleagues, and do echo I love the civil rights frame. I think that has been missing frame around housing for a long time. So I really appreciate AIA, and because housing really is a civil rights issue. It's so explicitly linked to your jobs, what schools your kids go to, what kind of food you have access to. I mean, all the fundamentals point to housing. And as we've reached this crisis mode in Los Angeles, where we really are the most unaffordable place, people are paying way more, and so they don't have money left for those other things of life. And so we need to solve this. Planners, I think, have a unique role for having worked with the real estate interests to create this, and now we need to be at the forefront of getting to a more livable, affordable city for all. And certainly I love the idea of linking this to civil rights and redressing those harms of the past. And I welcome the participation of everyone as we roll this out in the next 3 years of this ambitious rezoning plan. We need the help of architects. Design obviously has an important role here, and we'll be working closely with the AIA to show some good visuals and roll these out and refine these concepts. So just, again, great panel. Thank you for everybody.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists. I hope that we can continue this dialogue over the course of the next few months and even years to continue to keep the issue of housing as a civil right and the development of our city as a great world city. Keep that on the front burner of our minds here and push forward for the right policy to execute that.
Thank you so much.